Charles Henry McIntosh was a 19th century preacher, writer of Bible commentaries, and magazine editor. He said, "If we could only look upon a difficult crisis as an occasion of bringing out on our behalf the sufficiency of divine grace, it would enable us to preserve the balance of our souls and to glorify God, even in the deepest waters." Well, that's great advice to help us through most struggles. But the words difficult crisis and deepest waters barely scratch the surface in describing the barrage of tragedies that a man named Job had to face. They were just off the chart. The book of Job is designed to stimulate your mind by raising huge questions about God's character and the meaning of human suffering. Job is described as blameless and upright, a man who feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was considered the greatest man among all the people of the East. The first chapter of Job features this strange conversation in God's divine command center. An adversary challenges Job's faith, claiming that he fears God for nothing. He suggests that Job is comfortable and successful, but if his family and flocks were taken away, then he will curse God to his face. Now, it's important to know that the book of Job is not about good versus evil, where God and Satan make bets and leave innocent people's fates hanging in the balance. Rather, it raises bigger questions like, is it possible that good people could experience horrible pain and selfish people could succeed in God's world? And if so, what does that say about God's character? Well, God removes his protection from everything outside of Job himself, his herds, his servants, and his family. Job 1 says, "One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, 'The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, 'The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' And while he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, 'The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' And while he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, 'Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' 4 messengers delivered blow after blow after blow after blow. In one day, Job lost not some, but all of his flocks and his herds, all of his servants, and all of his children. It was unimaginable and terrible. And we would understand if Job just withdrew and retreated into solitude to try and process everything. But he didn't. Job 1:20-22 says, "At this, Job got up, he tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised.'" So in all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Tearing his robe and shaving his head were symbolic actions in ancient Jewish culture. They reflected the profoundly human experience of grappling with overwhelming loss and vividly expressed Job's grief and mourning. Worshiping while on the ground displayed his humility and submission to God, even in the midst of his suffering. Job's response to these impossible events, well, it's inspiring. I'd like to think that I could follow his example if my life was turned upside down like that, but I doubt it. And you may question that too, or at least the ability to immediately go on record with a public response. Listen, there is nothing wrong with, in fact, there is everything right about withdrawing in solitude with God. Job's response was unusual. In chapter 2, Job's faith is challenged again. It was suggested that he would change his tune if his own body suffered. God allowed Job's body to be afflicted with sores from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head. He sat among the ashes and scraped his sores with a piece of broken pottery. Job's wife had enough and just told him to curse God and die. But in all this, Scripture says, Job did not sin in what he said. At this point, we're introduced to three of Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They heard about his troubles, and they came together to comfort him. Job 2:12 and 13 says, when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. And they began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and nights, and no one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. These guys, they showed great empathy for their friend. We often think that we need to say something to comfort someone, the right verse or a meaningful quote. These guys just sat on the ground with Job, speechless. Hey, listen, don't miss the opportunity to just be in the room. It's powerful. With no relief in sight, Job's pain begins to wear him down. In chapter 3, he curses the day he was born and sounds depressed and hopeless. He says, sighing has become my daily food. My groans pour out like water. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. This begins a back and forth conversation between Job and his friends. They thought Job must have done something wrong to get himself in this predicament. Their theory was that suffering is a punishment for sin and prosperity is a reward for righteousness. His friend Eliphaz said, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil, those who sow trouble, reap it. Well, there's some truth in that. Sowing and reaping are part of the laws of the harvest. We'll take a look at that in session 5, but Eliphaz is strictly connecting Job's suffering with something evil he must have done. That is not always the case. The innocent and upright are not exempt from trouble. Jesus said that God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, bad things will happen to bad people, but so will good things. Good things will happen to good people, but so will bad things. Remember the two promises that Jesus made in John 16:33. I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world, you will have trouble. All of us can count on trouble. Job's friends would object and they'd say, nah, trouble is only for those who deserve it. Eliphaz gives Job a narrow diagnosis and solution. You must have done something wrong. Therefore, if I were you, I would appeal to God. I would lay my case before him. Blessed is the one whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. Well, there's some truth in that. We should always welcome God's correction and discipline because He has our best interest in mind. In session 6, we'll learn how God's discipline can be a good part of life's interruptions. Job's friend Bildad supports the case made by Eliphaz. He said, "If you will seek God earnestly and plead with the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, even now, He will rouse Himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state." Earnestly seeking God is always good advice. God Himself says, "You will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart." The challenge in all this is fine-tuning to God and His voice in the midst of all the well-meaning, but sometimes mistaken opinions of others. The flaw in the analysis and advice from Job's friends is that they were narrow and linear in their thinking. What they proposed sounded logical, but it was limited. It was very much cause and effect. Your suffering was caused by something you did. Therefore, if you do this, your suffering will go away, and you will be restored and prosperous again. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar jumped to conclusions and misrepresented God with advice skewed by self-righteousness. It would have been better if they had just continued to sit with Job in silence. One of the things I love about the Bible is that it doesn't pull any punches. It reveals the good, the bad, and the ugly of humanity. Job 9 records the raw emotions of a man physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and spiritually depleted. You may not be able to relate to the first part of Job's story, where he praised God after losing everything, including all 10 of his children, in a single day. But if you're reeling from great loss and overwhelmed with grief, you might connect more with Job's expression of despair and a feeling of hopelessness here. Job's friends directed him to appeal to God and plead his case. Well, here's some excerpts from Job's response. He said, "Indeed, I know that this is true, but how can mere mortals prove their innocence before God? Though they wish to dispute with Him, they cannot answer Him one time out of 1,000. Who has resisted Him and come out unscathed? He moves mountains without their knowing it and overturns them in His anger. He shakes the earth from its place and makes its pillars tremble. He speaks to the sun and it does not shine. He seals off the light of the stars. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. When He passes me, I cannot see Him. When He goes by, I cannot perceive Him. If He snatches away, who can stop Him? Who can say to Him, 'What are you doing?' God does not restrain His anger. Even if I summoned Him and He responded, I do not believe He would give me a hearing. He would crush me with a storm and multiply my wounds for no reason. He would not let me catch my breath, but would overwhelm me with misery." Well, Job expressed an incomplete understanding of God through the filter of his own experience. We do the same. Overall, Job affirmed that God was sovereign and answered to no one. Dispute with Him or resist Him, and, well, you'll suffer the consequences. Job rightly identified God not as one among many, but as the one and only. He said, He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. But his assessment of God was negative. Job implied that God had fallen asleep at the wheel in running the universe. And because of this divine neglect, he's had to endure unjust suffering. He believed that God randomly shakes the earth from its axis and stops the sun and stars from shining and arbitrarily snatches things away. And you know what? You better not question him because God was angry and inaccessible. Job believed if he did get the nerve to request a hearing with God, he'd be crushed. And God would just multiply his wounds for no reason. In this part of Job's story, we see God's incredible patience in allowing us to cry out to him, even if our way of doing it is misguided. The good news is this: if you're disappointed or confused or even angry with God, you can tell him exactly how you feel. His love and grace are shock-proof. He's not surprised by anything we reveal. Healing can only begin when we admit what's going on inside. You see, there's no healing without revealing. God is already fully aware. The revealing part is for us to see what he sees. Psalm 22, 1 and 2 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. That's how Jesus felt when he hung on the cross. And that's how Job felt. As Job expressed the turmoil in his heart and in his mind, he slowly began to move in the right direction. At the end of chapter 9, he considered his options. Option number 1, put on a happy face. Job 9, 27 and 28, if I say, I will forget my complaint, I will change my expression and smile, I still dread all my sufferings. He could just keep up appearances, try to see the glass half full, learn to make lemonade out of an avalanche of lemons. And when people ask him how he was doing, he could say something like, well, when God closes a door, he always opens a window. Or it's always darkest before the dawn. Job just wasn't buying it. Option 2, what's the point? Job 9, 29 through 31, it says, since I am already found guilty, why should I struggle in vain? Even if I wash myself with soap and my hands with cleansing powder, you would plunge me into a slime pit so that even my clothes would detest me. Job was not only convinced that he could do nothing to improve his predicament, he also believed that any attempt he made would only make matters worse. So, what's the point? As hopeless as that sounds, he was still moving in the right direction, bringing him closer to the best solution. That's option 3, the need for a mediator. A mediator is someone who can relate to both parties in a dispute. Job 9, 32 through 35 says, he is not a mere mortal like me that I might answer him, that we might confront each other in court. If only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot. One of the things I love about God's word is how there are so many places in the Old Testament, like this in Job, that point us to Jesus. 1 Timothy 2, 5 and 6 says, for there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man, Jesus Christ, who gave himself as a ransom for all people. In the last session, we looked at Hebrews 4 to explain how the sovereign God of creation was not detached and uncaring, but compassionate and accessible. Verse 15 says, we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. For this reason, verse 16 says, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Well, at this point, Job had zero confidence to approach God's throne. That's why he wanted a mediator. But the kind of mediator he wanted was not the kind he needed. We'll take a closer look at that in the next session.
My son, Blake, was born in 1986, and it didn't take long to realize that he was going to have a personality just bigger than life. As he grew older into his teen years, he had an affinity for any competitive sport that was available to him. He played varsity football, he was in Taekwondo, he was a second-degree black belt, he ran track and played basketball, and I always thought to myself, and I told a number of people, when I grow up, I want to be like my son. I mean, he was my hero. He graduated in 2005, which was kind of the wake of the 9/11 experience. And Blake had an idealistic sort of view, and he knew the difference between right and wrong. And I think that influenced him greatly to go into the military. Went into boot camp and immediately was deployed overseas in Iraq. He served 2 consecutive tours of duty in Iraq, spanning over 13 months, which is an incredibly long time for a 19, 20-year-old young man to be in combat. In March of 2009, he left the military, and he didn't make the transition back into civilian life very well. And while my son won many skirmishes and battles abroad, he lost the final battle at home on January 21st, 2010. My life went into a very, very dark place that night. It was traumatic for me. I couldn't understand how my son, that was so strong emotionally, mentally, and physically, could be overcome by such pain. That just tells me how much pain he was in to make the decision that he did that night. There were days I would wake up and just think to myself, I don't know if I can make it through the day or not, carrying this pain. I would go to bed most nights crying. I would literally pray in the middle of the night, God, don't let me wake up tomorrow morning, because I just don't want to experience the ongoing pain. It was just too much to bear. I was angry with God, and I would scream and yell until I was hoarse. I would demand from God, why did you do this to my son? Right after Blake's death, there were a lot of people in my life at church and friends and family that had well-meaning intentions, and they would offer Bible scriptures or books to try to help me understand how what I was going through. And to be honest with you, it made it worse. It just felt like people were trying to quickly give me a superficial answer. I felt it was a superficial answer to such a traumatic event. And it just didn't resonate with me. What helped me the most, what was the most benefit to me, was having a group of believers, a group of men that surrounded me. I remember this distinctly. My son died on a Thursday night, and Friday morning I had a couple of guys sitting around a picnic table, and I was crying, and it was silent, and one of the guys just looked at me and says, I don't know what you need. What do you need from us? And all I could muster through my tears was, I just need you to sit there. And Charlie looked at me and said, I can do that. And for the next 6 months, the next year, Charlie and David in tears just sat there. And that gave me so much hope. I remember demanding answers and wanting answers and screaming at God and just so angry. And I came across Psalm 46:10. Be still, quit striving, and know that I am God. And that simple passage right there just told me, settle down, just relax. I'm here. God has never left me. I've been angry with him. I've pushed him away. I've cursed him. But he's bigger than my emotions and my anger, and he never left me. And I've seen God and the friends and the family and the support that I've gotten. I've seen his love through those people.